Hi poetry lovers, welcome to my channel Bella Poetry Presents. My name is Bella and I love beautiful poetry. In our fifth segment of the third series, The Best Russian Poets of the Silver Age, we will discuss a very interesting and tragic life of a Russian poetess, Marina Tsvetaeva. Her work is considered among some of the greatest in the 20th century Russian literature. Marina Tsvetaeva was born in Moscow on September 26, 1892. She was the daughter of Ivan Tsvetaev, a professor of fine arts at the University of Moscow, who later founded the Alexander III Museum of Fine Arts, known from 1937 as the Pushkin Museum. Tsvetaeva's mother, Maria Main, Ivan's second wife, was a concert pianist. She was a highly literate, very educated woman with a German and Polish ancestry. Marina Tsvetaeva grew up in a wealthy home, and she will later identify herself with Polish aristocracy. She had two half-siblings, Valeria and Andrei, who were the children of Ivan's, her father's deceased first wife, Varvara. Tsvetaeva had only one full sister, whose name was Anastasia, and she was born 2 years after Tsvetaeva was born in 1894. The children quarreled frequently, and occasionally their quarrels were even violent. There was considerable tension between Tsvetaeva's mother and Varvara's children, and Tsvetaeva's father made it a point to maintain very friendly relationships with Varvara's family. Tsvetaeva's father was kind but deeply wrapped in his studies and his work, and very distant from his family. He was also still very deeply in love with his first wife, Varvara. That absolutely affected his relationship with his second wife, Maria. Well, on Maria's side, she was also in love with someone she loved before. She had a love affair with someone before her marriage to Ivan, and so she still loved this man. So here you have a couple who came together, who brought two daughters into the world, but at the same time their mind and their hearts were somewhere else with other people. Maria disapproved of Marina's poetic inclination. She wanted her daughter to become a pianist because she didn't hold a very high opinion of her poetry. In 1902, Maria contracted tuberculosis, and so the doctors recommended a change in climate to help her cure the disease. The family traveled abroad to Italy and stayed there until 1906, when she passed away. Marina Tsvetaeva was only 14 years old at that time. They lived for a while by the sea at Nervi, which is in Italy. There, away from the rigid constraints of bourgeois Muscovite life, Tsvetaeva was able for the first time to run free, enjoy nature, climb cliffs, and vent her imagination in childhood games. There were many immigrants there, Russian revolutionaries residing at the time in Italy, in the place called Nervi, where Tsvetaeva's family stayed. And they had obviously an influence on young Tsvetaeva. In June 1904, Tsvetaeva was sent to school in Lausanne in Switzerland. Changes in the Tsvetaeva residence led to several changes in school, and during the course of her travel, she acquired the Italian, French, and German languages. She gave up the strict musical studies that her mother had imposed on her, and fortunately for all the people who love Tsvetaeva, she turned to poetry. She wrote in one of her journals, "With a mother like her, I had only one choice: to become a poet." In 1908, age 16, Tsvetaeva studied literary history at the Sorbonne. During this time, a major revolutionary change was occurring in Russian poetry. It was the time of the flowering of Russian symbolist movement, and this movement greatly affected her later work. Her first collection of poems, called Вечерний альбом, or the Evening Album, was self-published in 1910 and promoted her considerable reputation as a poet. It was very well received. It attracted the attention of a poet and critic, Maximilian Voloshin, who came to see Tsvetaeva and soon became her friend and mentor. She began spending time at Voloshin's home in the Black Sea resort of Koktebel, which was a well-known haven for writers, poets, and artists. She fell in love with the work of Alexander Blok and Anna Akhmatova. She actually never met Blok, and she only met Akhmatova in 1940s. She and Akhmatova later became kind of competitors, and people were debating who is better, but both were very, very talented poetesses. At Koktebel, Tsvetaeva met her future husband, Sergei Afron. He was a cadet in the Officers' Academy. He was 19, she was 18. She was 19 and he was 18. They fell in love and they were married in 1912. The same year as her father's project, the Alexander III Museum of Fine Arts was ceremonially opened, and the event, a very important event that was attended by Nicholas II himself, Nikolai II, Nicholas II. Tsvetaeva's love for Afron was very passionate and intense. However, it didn't prevent her from having many affairs. She had an affair with Osip Mandelstam. We talked about him in the previous segment. Although he was married, she had an affair with him, and she celebrated this affair in a collection of poems called Mileposts. At around the same time, she became involved in an affair with the poet Sofia Parnok. Sofia Parnok was 7 years older than Tsvetaeva, and this affair caused a great distress to her husband. Two women fell deeply in love, and the relationship profoundly affected their writings, their work. Tsvetaeva and her husband spent summers in Crimea until the revolution, and they had 2 daughters together. The oldest one was born in 1912, and they called her Ariadna, or affectionately Alia, and the second one, Irina, was born in 1917, 3 years later. In 1914, Afron volunteered for the front, and by 1917, he became an officer, and he was stationed in Moscow. After 1917 revolution, Afron joined the White Army, and Marina returned to Moscow, hoping to be reunited with her husband, whom she loved very much. But instead, she was trapped in Moscow for 5 years during a terrible famine that very badly affected her family. She wrote 6 plays in verse and narrative poems between 1917 and 1922. She wrote an epic verse cycle, Lebedziny Stan, in translation, The Encampment of Swans, about the Civil War, glorifying those who fought um, against the communists. So she was very much against the communists. The Moscow famine deeply affected Tsvetaeva. She had no family to turn to for help. She had no way to support her daughters and herself. In 1919, she made a decision to place her daughters in a state orphanage. She hoped that the government will give them food because she had no food to give her children. But the case was absolutely different and ended up in tragedy. Alia, her first oldest daughter, became ill and Tsvetaeva removed her from the orphanage, but Irina, the youngest daughter, died there at the age of 3 in 1920 from starvation. Obviously, Tsvetaeva was heartbroken. She was filled with grief and regret. In one letter, she wrote, "God punished me." In May 1922, Tsvetaeva and Alia, her oldest daughter, left Soviet Russia and were reunited with her husband Efron in Berlin. She thought that he was killed by the Bolsheviks, but he actually survived, and they met in Berlin. There she published a collection Separations, Poems to Block, and the poem The Tsar Maiden. Most of her poetry was published in Moscow and in Berlin, and they basically consolidated her reputation as one of the best poets of Silver Age of Russia. In August 1922, the family moved to Prague, living in terrible poverty, unable to afford living accommodation in Prague itself, with Efron studying politics and sociology at the Charles University and living in hostels. Tsvetaeva and Alia, her older daughter, found rooms in a village outside the city. She wrote, "We're devoured by coal, gas, the milkman, the baker. The only meat we eat is horse meat." When offered an opportunity to earn money by reading her poetry, she had to beg for a simple dress from a friend to replace the one she had been living in. But at the time, Tsvetaeva, in spite of the poverty, she managed to have a passionate affair with Konstantin Radzhevich, a former military officer, a liaison which became widely known throughout immigrant community. And again, her husband Efron, who really loved her, was devastated. At about the same time, Tsvetaeva began correspondence with poet Rainer Maria Rilke and novelist Boris Pasternak. Tsvetaeva and Pasternak were not to meet for nearly 20 years, but maintained friendship until Tsvetaeva's return to Russia. In summer 1924, Efron and Tsvetaeva left for the suburbs where Marina conceived her son, who they called Georgy, and later she nicknamed him More. In the beginning, she wanted to call him Boris after Pasternak. There are some accounts that say that Tsvetaeva, who easily fell in love, was infatuated with Pasternak. Efron insisted on Georgy. Georgy was not an easy child. He was very difficult, he didn't behave well, but Tsvetaeva loved him more than anyone. With Efron now rarely free from tuberculosis, their daughter Alia was relegated to the role of mother's helper and confidant, and consequently was robbed of her childhood, which she later talked about in her book about her family. In 1925, the family settled in Paris, where they would live for the next 14 years. At about this time, Tsvetaeva had a relapse of tuberculosis she had previously contracted in 1902. She received a small stipend from the Czechoslovak government, which gave financial support to writers and artists who lived at one point in Czechoslovakia. In addition, she tried to make whatever she could from reading and the sales of her work. She turned more and more to prose because she found it out that prose made more money than poetry. Tsvetaeva didn't feel at home in Paris' predominantly ex-bourgeois circle of Russian immigrant writers. Describing her misery, she wrote, "In Paris, with rare personal exceptions, everyone hates me. They write all sorts of nasty things about me, leave me out in all sorts of nasty ways," and so on. To Pasternak, who she corresponded with, she complained, "They don't like poetry, and what am I apart from that? Not poetry, but that from which it is made. I am an inhospitable hostess, a young woman in an old dress." She began to look back at even the Prague times with nostalgia and really resent her exile even more deeply. Meanwhile, Tsvetaeva's husband Efron was developing sympathies for the Soviet regime, and he was very homesick for Russia. Eventually, he began working for NKVD, which was another name for KGB. It preceded the KGB. Their daughter Alia shared his views and increasingly turned against her mother. In 1937, she returned to the Soviet Union. Later that year, Efron too had to return to the USSR. The French police had implicated Efron, who was Marina's husband, in the murder of the former Soviet defector Rice in September 1937 on a country lane near Lausanne, Switzerland. After Efron's escape, the police interrogated Tsvetaeva, but she seemed confused by their questions and ended up reading them some French translations of her poetry. The police concluded that she was deranged and knew nothing of the murder. Later that year, people learned about Efron that he had possibly took part in the assassination of Trotsky's son in 1936. Tsvetaeva didn't seem to know that her husband was actually a spy for the Soviet Union, and she had no idea that he was implicated in these horrible murders. However, she was held responsible for his actions and was ostracized in Paris because of the implication that her husband was involved in Soviet secret service. In 1939, her son and she returned to Moscow, unaware of the reception she would receive. In Stalin's USSR, anyone who lived abroad was considered a spy. Tsvetaeva's sister had been arrested before Tsvetaeva's return. Although Anastasia survived the Stalin years, the sisters never saw each other again. Tsvetaeva, when she arrived to Russia, found out that all doors were closed to her. She got bits of work translating poetry, but otherwise the established Soviet writers refused to help her and chose to ignore her plight. Efron, her husband, and Alia, her daughter, were arrested on espionage charges in 1941. Her husband, Efron, was sentenced to death. Alia's fiancé was actually an NKVD agent, and he was assigned to spy on her family. Efron was shot in September 1941. Alia served over 8 years in prison. Both were exonerated after Stalin's death. In 1941, Tsvetaeva and her son were evacuated to Yelabuga because it was the beginning of World War II in Russia, and so a lot of people were evacuated to the east. Most families of the Union of Soviet Writers were evacuated to a town called Chistopol. In Yelabuga, Tsvetaeva had no means to support herself. She was really starving. And on August 24, 1941, she left for Chistopol desperately seeking a job. On August 26, Marina Tsvetaeva and poet Valentin Parnak applied to the Soviet Literature Fund asking for a job at Litfund's canteen. Parnak was accepted as a doorman, while Tsvetaeva's application to live in Chistopol was turned out, and she had to return to Yelabuga on August 28, 1941. On August 31st, 1941, Tsvetaeva hanged herself in Yelabuga. She left a note for her son, Moore. "Forgive me, but to go on would be worse. I'm gravely ill. This is not me anymore. I love you passionately. Do understand that I could not live anymore. Tell Papa and Alia, if you ever see them, that I love them to the last moment, and explain to them that I found myself in a trap." And you can definitely understand her. She had no job, she was starving, and people would say, well, she left her son behind, but she probably was going through a terrible depression, and as she said in her note, in her letter, she felt totally trapped. Her son, Georgy, volunteered for the Eastern Front during World War II and died in the battle in 1944. According to the book The Death of a Poet, The Last Days of Marina Tsvetaeva, the local NKVD department tried to force Tsvetaeva to start working as their informant. So she obviously, her conscience and her integrity would not allow her to do that. She had no money, and so she didn't see any other exit out of the situation but a suicide. She was buried in Yelabuga Cemetery on September 2nd, 1941. But the exact location of her grave remains unknown. Her daughter, Alia, spent 16 years in Soviet prison camps and exile and was released in 1955. Alia wrote a memoir of her family. An English language edition was published in 2009. Alia died in 1975. In a town of Yelabuga, the Tsvetaeva's house now is a museum, and there is a monument to her. The apartment in Moscow, where she lived from 1914 to 1922, is now a museum as well. Much of her poetry was republished in the Soviet Union after 1961, and her passionate, articulate, and precise work with its daring linguistic experimentation brought her increasing recognition as a major Russian poet. And there's one more interesting fact, is that a minor planet, 3511 Tsvetaeva, discovered in 1982 by Soviet astronomer Lyudmila Karachkina, is named after her. I love Akhmatova, and I absolutely love Marina Tsvetaeva. So we're going to read a few poems by her. Again, the translations are not the best, but it will give you an idea of how she wrote. Marina Tsvetaeva. Some made of stone, others of clay. Some made of stone, others of clay, but none of them sparkle like me. Marina's my name, caprice is my way. I am the transient foam of the sea. Some made of clay, others of flesh, for them there are tombstones and graves. I am baptized at sea and broken afresh every day as I soar on the waves. No matter what heart, no matter what net, my will break through them all. See the curls that are dangling loose on my head. I'll never be turned into salt. I am broken against your knees made of stone, but each coming wave sets me free. I am resurrected, all hail the foam, the high, lively foam of the sea. And as I said before, I love the translation of Andrei Neller, and this one is his very successful translation. And we'll read this poem in Russian. Кто создан из камня, кто создан из глины. Кто создан из камня, кто создан из глины. А я серебрюсь и сверкаю, мне дело измена, мне имя Марина. Я бренная пена морская. Кто создан из глины, кто создан из плоти, тем гроб и надгромные плиты, в купели морской крещена и в полете своем непрестанно разбита. Сквозь каждое сердце, сквозь каждые сети пробьется мое своеволие. Меня, видишь, кудри беспутные эти, земною не сделаешь сою. Дробясь о гранитные ваши колена, я с каждой волной воскресаю. Да здравствует пена, веселая пена, высокая пена морская. This poem was written when she was in Moscow, when she lived in Moscow in 1920. And here is another poem that is very famous, which is called I Like That You're Not Obsessed With Me. I like that you're not obsessed with me. Like that, I have no obsession either. And not for once in the eternity, the heavy earth between our feet will wither. I can be funny and be free, be careless with words and never bother to be betrayed by tide of blush when we brush our sleeves when passing one another. I also like that in my company you are confident enough to hug the other. You don't foretell infernal suffering to me for being kissed by other lovers. I also like you never call in vain the sweet infection of my name, you sweetie, and that will never live to see the day when wedding bells hail us with nuptial greetings. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for loving me so much quite unawares, for nightly peace that you will never thwart, for twilight dates that cannot be more scarce, for moonlight walks that we will never start, and for the sun above will never wear us. For you, alas, who are not obsessed with me, for me, alas, with no obsession either. And it was translated by Dina Bilaeva. And now I'll read it to you in Russian. Мне нравится, что вы больны не мной. Мне нравится, что я больна не вами, что иногда тяжелый шар земной не уплывет под нашими ногами. Мне нравится, что можно быть смешной, распущенной и не играть словами, не краснеть удушливой волной, слегка соприкоснувшись рукавами. Мне нравится еще, что вы при мне, спокойно обнимаете друг другу, не прочите мне в адовом огне гореть за то, что я не вас целую. Что имя нежное мое, мой нежный, не упоминайте ни днем, ни ночью в суе, что никогда в церковной тишине не пропоют над нами аллилуйя. Спасибо вам, и сердцем, и рукой, за то, что вы меня, не зная сами, так любите, за мной ночной покой, за редкость встреч закатными часами, за наше негуляние под луной, за солнце не у нас над головами, за то, что вы больны не мной. Увы, не мной, за то, что я больна не вами. Beautiful, beautiful poem. Very famous in Russian. And with this poem, we finish our 5th segment of Bella Poetry Presents, of our 3rd series about the Russian poets of the Silver Age. And in our 6th segment, we will discuss a very short but interesting life of another Russian poet, Vladimir Mayakovsky. Please join us next time. Thank you very much for visiting Bella Poetry Presents. Please don't forget to like and to subscribe, and have a wonderful day. Thank you. Bye-bye.